Nahida, once the embodiment of Dendro itself, she eventually found herself sidelined by newer characters. Today we will uncover what really went wrong with Nahida, starting with her early release, the rise to dominance, and finally her unexpected downfall. Act 1. The release. When Nahida was on the horizon, the community had high expectations after the success of the Raiden Shogun, the previous Archon. At this point in the game, Hoyo Ari introduced Dendro as the newest element, and with the only two Dendro supports being Kale and Dendro MC, the element seems like it's missing its final piece. Because not only are they burst reliant, but you're also stuck with circle impact. Among the two, DMC's radius is a bit better when their burst is infused with Hydro. However, it comes at the cost of literally blowing up and disappearing if it comes into contact with Pyro. Also at the same time, the strongest Dendro reactions were Hyper Bloom and Nilou Bountiful Cores, both of which were being bottlenecked by the weak Dendro application from Kale and DMC. To better understand this, if Dendro exists on an enemy and Hydro is applied, then you will get 2 seeds as a result, which is the ideal situation to maximize your Bloom and Hyper Bloom damage. However, if it is the other way around and you apply Dendro to Hydro, then only 1 Bloom core is generated due to it being a forward reaction. But elemental gauge theory isn't the focus of this video, so all you really need to know is that this is not ideal because less cores equals less damage. Unfortunately, this is almost always the case with Xingqiu and Yelan, as they are the most prominent Hydro sub DPS and are known to apply a lot of Hydro. It can somewhat be negated by bringing both Kale and DMC, but with Kale's short burst duration, the duo still isn't enough to sustain Bloom generations over the entire rotation, especially in a Nilou team. In summary, the community is in dire need of good off-field Dendro application, because that's what Dendro is lacking the most at the moment. Thankfully, Hoyoverse didn't play around this time, and actually delivered exactly just that in Nahida's early kit. Firstly, Nahida's Dendro application is tied mostly to her skill, making her non-burst reliant, but that doesn't mean that her burst is useless, because it further strengthens her already strong application from her skill, while also giving a hefty amount of EM buff. And the cherry on top of everything is that her burst only costs 50 energy, which was extremely low and manageable. So without even any playtesting, many were already claiming that Sumeru meta is looking to revolve around Nahida. Her kit seems more central to the region's meta than the last Archons. Although some players were let down by her having to use a camera mid-battle, no kit and playstyle can fit everyone's taste, so generally the community agrees that she'll become the most valuable unit in any Dendro team. However, no releases ever come without skepticism, with posts expressing concern just one day into her banner, saying that Nahida is kinda underwhelming, essentially claiming that she forces very specific team comps because Cryo and Animal just doesn't work with Nahida, and overall she just feels gimmicky and lacking at the same time. Perhaps all these misconceptions came from players not fully understanding how Dendro works, because at this point, some still believe that you should build full EM on aggravate triggers like Fischl, which is something that you shouldn't do because aggravate can crit. All of this was totally understandable because Dendro was the most complex element added to the game, with a lot of sub-interactions that not all players were familiar with at the time. However, the sentiment quickly shifted as the player base had more time to properly play and test out Nahida. Act 2. The Rise. After the community experienced proper gameplay, Nahida immediately became a game changer and turned out to be absurdly strong and versatile, elevating Dendro teams to the pinnacle of the meta. Within the first week, Nahida was being hailed as a unit in a league of her own, who broke both the DPS and support role. This wasn't just a hyperbole, because there's data to back it up, as her debut banner with Yoimiya grossed over $34 million. For context, this surpassed even the well-beloved Raiden Shogun's previous record. Not only that, in her very first Abyss rotation in 3.2, Nahida debuted at an impressive 60% usage rate, only behind already established meta units at the time. It wasn't just numbers that made Nahida enjoyable though, it was also the quality of life and utility. Players love how comfortable she was in combat. Her skills camera could tag all enemies within a blink. Her burst duration lasts for a really long time, ensuring all her buffs are essentially always up. And outside combat, Nahida even had a fun exploration passive, but she could collect items from a far distance with her skill. And from a meta standpoint, Nahida pioneered the strongest team in the game back then, which was the Double Hydro Hyper Bloom team. This team not only broke the previous DPS ceiling, but also is extremely easy to play and has no energy issues, unlike how complicated it was to set up international teams, or executing Hu Tao and Ganyu combos, which were the other meta teams at the time, because all you really have to do is drop everyone's skill and burst and just normal attack away with Nahida. Nahida. This variant of Hyper Bloom is only possible because Nahida applies a ton of Dendro through her skill, and if more comfort is needed, you can choose Cookie for more healing. Otherwise, EM Raiden is the perfect offensive option with her 25-second skill duration, allowing for a 100% uptime. Although Hyper Bloom is primarily single target, it is so ridiculously strong to the point of being able to brute force AoE contents. Hyper Bloom was so strong that even a 3-unit team of Nahida, Xingqiu, and Cookie, or Raiden, became the strongest wheelchair core in the game, allowing characters like Eula to shine once again. That's just how meta-defining she felt back then. Nahida also featured in Aggravate teams with Keqing or Quicken teams with Tighnari, and proved very useful with her EM buff from her burst. Version is another archetype that Nahida can enable. Now, if that wasn't good enough, Nahida also complete the missing puzzle piece in the Nilou team, making it the best team in AoE, while also still extremely simple to pilot. So now Nahida possesses both the best AoE and single target team. But that's not the sole factor that made her stand on top of the meta, because the Spiral Abyss requires 2 teams, and Nahida just happens to not use Bennett, which is a core component for national teams. These teams were so strong and versatile that they could essentially handle all contents thrown at them, forging the most iconic dual comps for the longest time. Her meta relevance didn't stop there with the introduction of Alhaitham in 3.4, propelling Dendro teams to its peak with his Quick Bloom team. This team works by applying Hydro slow enough so the quicken aura can be maintained, so Alhaitham can still spread his damage, which is very important because his personal damage is sizable, enough to even replace Xingqiu in this spot, introducing the first team ever that broke the 80k DPS mark. Then the next couple of patches saw the introduction of 2 other 4-star releases in the name of Yao Yao and Kirara. Despite being pretty decent themselves, neither affected the meta as they mainly brought a defensive alternative to Keqing Aggravate teams. So throughout her region of Sumeru, Nahida had always stood at the pinnacle of the meta, with Abyss usage rate consistently above 70%, and at a certain point almost reaching 100%. However, as the game progressed, cracks started to form in her throne, because Hoyoverse never let one dominate for too long. Act 3, The Decline. The introduction of Fontaine started to waver Nahida's meta relevance. This wasn't an overnight fall from grace, but a gradual progress as Hoyoverse introduced new characters, artifact sets, and content that just didn't play to Nahida's strength. To put it into perspective, coming out of Sumeru, the meta still consists of a version 1 team, International, alongside of Nahida's Hyper Bloom, both of which stood at roughly 75k DPS, and Linny as the first Fontaine character didn't pose much of a threat because although his most offensive team can break through this threshold, the quality of life of a charge attack user without a shooter can't be compared to Hyper Bloom. However, everything changed when Nouvelette was released. You see, the strong point of Hyper Bloom was its ease of play, and Nouvelette was a direct competitor in this regard, and on top of that, he can perform much better in AoE if you do the fidget spinner attack. Although Nouvelette didn't have higher damage initially, that was no longer the case after the release of Farina, his most synergistic teammate. Also, the most appealing aspect of Hyper Bloom was its low barrier to entry. All you really need is triple EM on your trigger and level that character to 90. However, the ease of entry now acts as a double-edged sword. As the game progresses, players actually have more time to invest into their artifacts now, making it much more appealing to invest in a hyper carry team like Nouvelette, and also the most game-breaking artifact, Marishasuse MH. I don't know how to pronounce it. Someone teach me in the comment. This was an artifact that enables your main DPS to get 36% crit rate, so long as there are enough HP fluctuations. And guess what? Farina is the exact character that by herself can enable this, so Nouvelette just has so many things go into his favor, while Nahida had none. Perhaps the glimmering light is that she can still be played alongside of Nouvelette in a Hyper Bloom team. However, subsequent character releases didn't change the situation for the better, because none of them had any synergy with Nahida. First was Chevreuse, who only wanted Electro and Pyro teammates. Although she was just a 4-star, she propelled Overload team to a level never seen before, with her multitude of buffs. So at this point, many Overload teams were actually getting over the Hyper Bloom threshold. Alongside Chevreuse was the release of Navia, the premier Geo DPS. She was yet another character that synergizes with Farina instead of Nahida. Then came the arrival of Gaming and Sheng Yun, another 2 characters that don't want Nahida in their teams, both of which were very strong but heavily overlooked by the community because of their clunkiness, so it didn't really affect Nahida's status too much. However, the same cannot be said about Arlecchino's release, because for the first time ever, there's a C2 character that can reach the 100k DPS, beating even Nouvelette. You see, Arlecchino is a very simple character to play. You can just spam normal attack and it will already do more damage than Hyper Bloom. In the past, Nahida stood at the top in both AoE and single target content with her Hyper Bloom and Nilou team. Now those niches belong to Nouvelette and Arlecchino, with both of them being very easy to play, which was the appeal of Nahida to begin with. And things didn't really get easier with the release of Natlan, a region that took power creep to the next level. Luckily, the first Natlan character, Mulan, Mualani can still make good use of Nahida because she's a forward vape character, and Nahida's burst still provides a very useful 250 EM. However, she faces heavy diminishing returns because Mualani's best teammate is actually Sucrose, that is much more synergistic with Mualani because she can provide VV and a similar amount of EM buff to Nahida while consuming way less fuel time. So it's only a matter of time until Nahida is completely replaced, and that time came immediately in the following patch with the release of Sulonin because she can provide scroll and rest shred. To make matters worse, Sulonin also works extremely well with Nuvolette, pushing Nahida out of the old Hyperbloom team. And afterwards was the release of Shaska, who once again doesn't really work with Nahida whatsoever. But the biggest meta shift actually occurred in 5.3 with the release of Mavuika and Sitlali. This duo brought the damage ceiling of C0 characters to the absolute next level at close to 140k DPS. To make matters worse, she is relatively simple to play, deals massive front load damage and sustained damage, all while having massive AoE with her charge attack, making her the undisputed best in both AoE and single target. This is a team that even C2 Nahida couldn't come close to competing with. Sadly, things didn't really get much better from here with the release of Skirk and Varessa because neither of them have Nahida in any variant of their best teams. At this point, Nahida has slipped to the worst usage rate since her release, not even tipping 10%. Perhaps the only ray of hope was Anefa, who came in 5.8 and could work in Hyperbloom, but that last hope was quickly shattered. You see, even up until this point, Nahida was essentially Dendro herself. Although her teams did get weaker, she was still the forefront of the element, as an Archon should be. However, the stature was heavily challenged when Llama was released because she also provides 100% uptime on Dendro application from her skill, similar to Nahida, albeit the application is not as strong, but in return, Llama has an innate 25% Hydro and Dendro shred in her skill. Also, her burst can buff bloom reactions by a relatively significant amount. This is in complete contrast with Nahida because although her burst is strong, it doesn't really help the Hyper Bloom trigger. So just the skill and burst alone were enough to power creep Nahida. However, Llama took it a step further when her passive also allowed bloom reactions to crit, much like C2 Nahida. So it is an outright upgrade to C0 Nahida. And in 2025 coming into 2026, Dendro is now back. And sadly, it isn't Nahida but Llama who brought the element back to life because Llama brings Hyper Bloom to a never seen before height of 115k DPS. Now, does this mean that Nahida is entirely useless now? This is the same question asked when Yelan was released, and many deem her to be the Xingqiu replacer. The fact of the matter is, you can still use both of them together. In Nahida's case, you can use her with Llama in a Nulu team. With everything said, Nahida still has a sizable EM buff in her kit, so she can still be relevant when a main Dendro DPS comes out, like Nefer. She can still provide great Dendro application, and also as a bonus, she can also provide TTDS or some form of healing with Prototype Amber. Also, the addition of Stitch and Onslaught changed team building requirements by demanding 3 teams instead of 2, so Nahida might still have a chance to shine when there are more slots open to welcome her, or there are bosses that favor Dendro like the one in this cycle. But let me know what you guys think. Do you guys still use Nahida? And do you think she'll ever return to the top of the meta once again? But anyways, that's it for the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.